The Great War had begun. Russia had mobilized against Germany and Germany against Russia, both unaware of what was to come. People had hoped and expected the war would be short-lived, and had not expected a war taking 4 years and many lives. There are these famous pictures of German soldiers in train wagons going to France. Texts can be read saying "trip to Paris" as if they are going on a vacation. These soldiers genuinely believed they would be back by Christmas. If only they knew. The art of war had a few tricks up its sleeve no one was aware of. War had changed, yet no one was aware of the changes. In this episode, we will go into the Russian response to the war and how that response, along with the many other issues discussed in previous episodes, paved the way for the empire's downfall. More importantly, in this episode we will look into the reasons why Russia failed this war miserably. Now, what did Russia bring to the table? In regards to numbers, the Russians could consider themselves to be equals to the Germans. The Russians even were able to hinder the German assault due to a secret mobilization, and were able to reach the Germans within 3 days instead of the expected 3 to 6 weeks, thereby obstructing the so-called von Schlieffen Plan. The von Schlieffen Plan was a plan developed by the German general Alfred von Schlieffen. Germany, although a strong militaristic power in Europe, wasn't strong enough to take on both Russia in the east and France in the west. The plan was to first neutralize France within approximately a month, after which the troops would be moved to Russia and then deal with them. Because of the false expectations of the Germans that the Russians wouldn't be able to advance within 3 days instead of at least a month, this plan got obstructed. Now the Germans had to fight on both fronts. When looking at the first few moments during the war, it wouldn't be too far from the truth to claim that Russia actually had a chance at defeating the German forces. The Russian generals von Rennenkampf, the name of whom is confusing, but he was Russian, and Samsonov even were able to put the Germans into the defensive in a very daring assault. So the Russians actually were quite successful, until the Russians seized their advance and spread their troops in order to forage for new resources and defend newly conquered positions, like captured fortifications. Because now the Russian troops had spread, the Germans were able to regroup and beat the Russians at Tannenberg, after which the German troops moved to the south and beating the Russians at the Missouri Lakes. Von Rennenkampf fled. The Germans jokingly called him Rennen von Kampf, or run from battle. Now, our question is why Russia failed so horribly. There are a few reasons as to why Russia performed so poorly during the rest of the war. Even though Russia was able to field 12 million men and therefore had the largest amount of troops mobilized, it still was a giant on feet of clay. Although Russia had a huge population, this wasn't as big of an advantage when we look at the portion of the population able to fight. The Russian population was very young. During the census of 1877, the scheduled census of December 1915 was postponed due to the outbreak of the war. It was found that the median age was 21.16. Many therefore hadn't reached an age fit for duty. Then there was the issue that of the 27 million potential recruits, 48% couldn't be recruited because of their status as the only breadwinner. So one reason was the composition of the population. The second reason can be found in the composition of the army itself. First of all, as I said, the way wars were fought had changed. In order to understand this, we have to look into how war had changed. In previous wars, infantry could rely on hand-to-hand combat. Now, the use of the machine gun was popularized. Along with things like barbed wire and mines, the area between two armies became a very dangerous zone, famously called the no man's land. Therefore, it became much more difficult to make huge advances on land and also resulted in troops digging themselves into trenches. Trench warfare was born. Along with the machine gun, airborne weapons along with sea weapons made killing from a distance much more effective. Where previously it was important to achieve territorial supremacy, now wars were won by simply outlasting the opponent, by fighting a so-called war of attrition. Russia wasn't able to adapt to this new kind of warfare. This, combined with inferior arms as well as inferior training, also were a huge issue. Only the first line of soldiers were armed and trained properly, and thus the combination of a large population not fit for war, along with the lack of adaptation to this new way of fighting, and the lack of proper training, chain of command, and arms resulting in many unnecessary casualties was a recipe for disaster. Now let's get deeper into this recipe because there are so many causes for this. During the first few months of the war, Russia suffered many casualties and therefore were forced to depend on the second line of military. As I explained earlier, these didn't receive any proper training or arms. Then there was the chain of command, divided between the headquarters in Baranovchi in Belarus, the Ministry of War, and the commanders in the field. These commanders were only interested in the pursuit of their own goals. The commanders highest in the chain of commands were selected from nobility and had up to no military training, education, or experience. For example, the commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nikolai, never took part in any battle, and the Minister of War was nothing more than an armchair soldier and had done almost nothing to make the army ready for combat. The officers in the field jumped from blunder to blunder, and it was clear they had learned nothing from the debacle that was the war against Japan. Once again, they fought according to an outdated 19th century doctrine, along with deadly charges against artillery despite the loss of troops. They wasted resources on obsolete cavalry, defended useless fortifications in the rear guard, and paid no attention to technological innovation this kind of warfare demanded, let alone on the art of trench building. The trenches lacked the demanded quality and were primitive. They could better be described as mass graves in the making. We should never underestimate the importance of morale and how it should be kept high when fighting for one's country. A realization the commanders apparently never had. Soldiers who failed to follow orders or refused to do so were whipped. Soldiers were obliged to clean the commander's shoes and had to do all these little tasks. It underlined the relationship between the farmer soldiers and their commanders that came from nobility, and as a result, worsened this relationship. To add insult to injury, the Tsarist structure of command consisting of higher nobility was thinned out due to the many casualties. The commanders that replaced them came from lower classes and felt more connected to the soldiers. These were the same commanders that would lead the Red Army during the Revolution of 1917. These were people like Zhukov, Chapayev, and Rokossovsky, who would become legends in their own right. just like how the commanders of the French king would become Napoleon's marshals. During May of 1915, the Germans and Austrians broke through the Russian lines, and the Tsarist army was forced to retreat. During this retreat, the Russian troops applied the scorched earth tactic and destroyed buildings, bridges, and farmland. In the so-called Cheta, the western part of the empire in which the Jews were forced to live, many Jewish possessions got destroyed. Millions of soldiers surrendered, and the endless retreat broke the morale of the troops. Others, now with guns in their hands, succumbed to banditry. Many conspiracy theories took over the minds of the troops. This wasn't out of the ordinary because of the very present German influence both at the royal court and the government. What also didn't help was the execution of Mia Sojitov, a prodigy of the Minister of War, as he was found guilty of espionage for the Germans. This was a turning point during the war and completely broke any confidence or morale the Russians had. Loyalty to the monarchy ceased to exist. A monarchy and a government that sent their men into a war that was impossible to win. No longer the troops were willing to let the blood of their own kinsmen to be shed. In a desperate attempt at repairing the morale and the loyalty of the troops, Nicholas himself took over command. He naively thought that if his troops weren't willing to fight for Russia, they might want to fight for him, for the Tsar. This possibly was the worst mistake he could have made, because now all failures, and there were many, now were blamed on him, and his presence worsened the already broken morale. In the words of General Brusilov, it was very clear to everyone that the Tsar did not understand a thing about war. And although the word Tsar still had this magical connotation to it, in reality, Nicholas lacked the charisma to bring alive this magic. He was nervous when he stood in front of his troops and didn't know what to say. So to summarize, the debacle that was the Russian war effort during World War I was due to a few reasons. Along with the problem that was the composition of the population, first of all, the way wars were fought had changed, and Russia wasn't able to adapt. This inability mostly stemmed from the unwillingness of the higher-ups in the chain of command to adapt. Again, they clinged to using a 19th century doctrine. The problems in the chain of command were huge. Not only were the commanders only interested in serving their own goals, they also had no regard for any of the technological and strategic advances this new type of warfare had demanded. Also, the lack of education and training of these higher-ups was a huge issue. They therefore weren't able to arm their troops properly, let alone train them properly. Overall, the Russian commanders hadn't learned their lesson from the Russo-Japanese War and stubbornly clinged to their old ways of handling stuff. Now you can imagine that the nation was at a breaking point. Already there was the smell of revolution as established during earlier episode. Now the future revolutionaries were armed and battle-hardened. Thank you so much for watching. During the next episode, we will continue this story about how the Russian Empire found its demise during the First World War, and we will take a look at what happened at the court during this time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and leave a comment. Again, thanks for watching, and talk to y'all later.